Alrighty, hello 7th graders. We're gonna get through about half of the final notes today, and then we'll probably finish the rest next week. So we'd finished the Civil War part, now we're on to the Reconstruction. And before we get into sort of the details of it, just a really quick overview. There are three different kinds of Reconstruction, and we would have like a little pamphlet we looked at if we were in class for this, but I'll give you sort of the rundown. You have Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. You have Andrew Johnson, his vice president's plan for Reconstruction. And you have Congress's plan for Reconstruction. It's also known as the Radical Republicans' plan for Reconstruction. So three different takes on it. And the United States kind of gets a mixture of all three, right? Because each person is not necessarily in charge for the entirety of Reconstruction. And so they all have different views in terms of like how former Confederates should be treated, if they should be allowed to participate in government, that kind of stuff. And like I said, it's a mixture of these. By the end of it, Reconstruction by a lot of historians is seen as a failure on some levels. Obviously, it's a success in that, yes, the United States is back together. The states will eventually rejoin the Union, participate in government, all that stuff. But it's argued a failure in the sense that if you're a former slave living in the South, your life didn't really change that much after the Civil War. Slavery is legally ended in those slave states, yet they're still kept in financial slavery. They're still oppressed by laws. You're going to have groups, have terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan that rises up at this time period. So life is still very, very bad in the South for black people. And that's why it's considered still a failure in a lot of ways. And some of these issues won't be addressed for literally almost 100 years. So, civil rights. So it's argued that none of these plans are particularly successful. Part of that's because they don't get all one plan because of the stuff that's constantly sort of switching around. And so just keep that in mind as we sort of talk about these. Abraham Lincoln being assassinated was a huge deal, right? We don't have to go into super detail. It's one of the things that almost everyone, I assume, knows about, right? But he goes to Ford's Theater. John Wilkes Booth, who was a famous actor at the time, goes up the balcony where Lincoln is, and he shoots him, kills him, right? It's a pretty horrifying moment for most Americans, particularly Northerners. You can imagine like having a president assassinated right after the Civil War was definitely a tumultuous time. It was very rocky. People were startled, scared, wondering what was going on. A lot of people in the North felt that the South collectively needed to be punished for this, right? That because of the actions of John Wilkes Booth, they felt that the South should have to pay. That Reconstruction should be worse for them. That they should all have to suffer for it, and not necessarily fair, right? You can't punish an entire group based off the actions of one guy. But that's what some people, even people who were in Congress, had thought at the time. And Lincoln's Reconstruction plan, sometimes referred to as the 10% plan, had this idea in place that if 10% of the people in a southern state took an oath of loyalty to the United States, came in and basically like apologized for their actions and took an oath to obey the laws of the United States, that state could rejoin the Union. Which they call it the 10% plan. Some people call it Lincoln's plan. There are people who said that was not strict enough, right? If 10% of a group of people are sorry, that doesn't mean the whole group is sorry, right? And there was heavy critique on Lincoln not punishing these states more. That was one of the things they didn't like about his plan. It did bar Confederate officials from like running for government. So if you served in the Confederate government, you weren't going to be allowed to participate in the Northern government. So in some places, he kind of stayed firm on certain punishments. But I mean, you can imagine how Northerners would react to the idea of only 10% have to swear an oath of loyalty. That's not ideal, right? And why did Lincoln choose 10%? You have to remember he was trying to rebuild the country as painlessly as possible after one of the most violent wars in the history of the world at the time, right? But now that he's been assassinated, there's a lot of concern as to like what parts of that plan are going to be carried on, right? The 10% won't be. It's going to be changed multiple times, but it was a pretty big concern. In terms of like what things are looking like in the South, you have an economy that is in shambles, right? Confederate money that people would exchange some of their life savings into is now worthless, right? The fact that slavery is supposed to be over means that these plantations are going to bankrupt themselves. They can't afford to pay labor at the time period. they're looking for ways to go around this. They're looking for new technologies, but some of them aren't adapting as quickly. And you have literal cities that are in actual ruins, right? Places that like Sherman's army had marched through obviously have been laid waste, right? Major cities in the South have been destroyed over the course of this war. They'd spent a lot of their money, in technologies and war materials that are now useless, right? And so life was not just bad for black Southerners, it's bad for everyone in the South. They had taken the brunt of the damage of the war. But things for these freedmen are also not great. Freedmen referring to slaves who are no longer slaves. They are literal free men, right? Rebuilding your family was difficult. You have to remember that, for one, these families were separated a lot of times, right? So rebuilding your family sometimes literally means like tracking down family members and like literally putting your family back together. They might be states away on different, old plantations and things. That process is very difficult. Also, very, very few slaves were prepared for what you'd call, quote, the real world, right? This idea of like you don't live on a plantation anymore. You're not someone's property. You have to go live off on your own. And while that's great, no longer being someone's slave, right? There are new responsibilities that you have never practiced or been educated for, right? These slaves don't know what it's like to have to go out and, look for paying work. They didn't understand, these former slaves didn't understand, in some cases, things like, how to buy a house, how to manage money, right? Those aren't skills slaves would normally have learned. And so, as a result, it's a very rocky transition for a lot of people. Now, there are some who do well. I'm sure there are numerous examples of slaves in the South who, getting their freedom are successful. But you have to think on the whole, a majority of them were not prepared for that. And, why would they be, right? So while it's better than being property, it's still a step up, right? It's not ideal. It's not the things that they're promised. It's not what some of them were envisioning life would be like after the Civil War. So a response to this is this creation called the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was a government organization that would provide food and education for these freed slaves, right? It would provide, education services for children. It would help, point adults in the right direction for, learning life skills, stuff like that. The downside, of this program is that it's very expensive, right? The government has to pay for this to provide these services to help, set these people up in a way they're taken care of. And Congress kind of becomes divided on helping with the Freedmen's Bureau. And what I mean by that is like some of them are very much pro. This is a great idea. We should continue it. But where they sort of start to draw lines is there's a lot of talk of like, where should the funding come from? Should northern states pay for this, or should we be taxing southern states to fund this program? There are some congressmen who push farther and say they should redistribute land. They should take land from these rich plantations and give it to the Freedmen's Bureau to then give out to these freed slaves. And that's where they sort of get pushback, because there are some people who believe that the South should be punished, but they sort of draw the line at taking someone's possessions and redistributing them, because at the end of the day, those rich Southerners still bought that land fairly, right? And so there's a lot of debate over what they should do. And to really sort of shift the public opinions of the time period, we have to talk about the vice president, who then becomes president after Lincoln's death, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is a Democratic senator from Tennessee. He is not a member of Lincoln's Republican Party, yet he was chosen as the vice president. And that nowadays would be pretty uncommon, right? Having a vice president from a different political party. But the idea was having Andrew Johnson on Lincoln's ticket was a way to appeal to border states that had owned slaves, states like Kentucky, right, Missouri. But also it was sort of a way to, not to make things a little bit better for the southern states before they had, left the Union. This idea of like showing that, look, he's not, when he first took office, he wasn't going to come in and, dismantle slavery. But obviously the plan didn't work. When Andrew Johnson takes office, he gets heavily critiqued by people in the North and the government for being too lenient on Southern leadership. So one of the changes to Reconstruction under Johnson is that he, if you made, I think it was over $100,000. There's a set amount of money. It was 100,000 or like 50,000 or something. If you owned a certain amount of slaves or you made too much money, you were barred from participating in government. You're seen as basically an outcast in the South unless you came to Andrew Johnson, met with him privately, and asked personally for forgiveness. So his system was that these rich, powerful Southerners who had participated in the Confederate government, the only way they were pardoned was to go to the president and privately ask him forgiveness. And on one hand, there's pros and cons to that, right? Because on one hand, that's a better, more fair deal, I guess, than saying just 10% of them would have to under Lincoln's plan, right? So in this case, all of these rich and powerful have to come and ask for forgiveness and sort of hat in hand, show humility, right? But on the other hand, if you're critical of Andrew Johnson, this looks real suspicious. He wants all the richest, most powerful Southerners to come meet with him privately and arrange forgiveness. There are arguments that there's like bribes going on, that there's shady backroom deals. There's no hard evidence of that, but overall he's seen as like, favoring the South. Tennessee was a Southern state. They're saying, look, he's, giving his people, special treatment, right? And so that's what we're talking about here when we talk about loyalty oaths, right? He also ends up, refusing to help these freedmen, practice the rights they were supposed to be promised, right? To be made, to give them the ability to vote to these former slaves, to treat them as true equals, right? And the result of this is that under Johnson's Reconstruction plan, a lot of the same people who were in power under the Confederate government ended up in power under these restored Southern governments. So people who are critical of him say, look, the same people who were in charge, who fought against the United States, who are responsible for the deaths of, tens of thousands of people, are just back where they were, are still running things. It would be very difficult, you can imagine, if you're a northern congressman, to go in the Senate or the House and have to sit there and vote with or against people who, a couple months ago were actively fighting against your country. And you're supposed to brush that off and say, well, they asked for forgiveness and they got a pardon, so it's okay, right? It'd be a hard adjustment. So you can see why Congress doesn't like this guy. Also under him, rights get even worse for some of these freedmen. So these are called the Black Codes. The Southern leaders, who used to be Confederate leaders that have returned to power under Johnson, pass a series of laws that targets these former slaves. And these laws obviously would be in no way legal nowadays, right? But in the South of the time period, if they can't exercise the right to vote, how can they stop these laws? They can't, right? It's white people making and voting for these laws. Majority of them had owned or supported slavery, right? These laws ban the participation of any jobs other than farming jobs or unskilled labor for former slaves. So they are not allowed to take jobs that require an education. They are banned in some of these states from jobs that would do that. They're only allowed to work jobs that they would have already worked if they were slaves. They are not allowed to vote. They're not allowed to go to school. There's no schools created for them. And the picture here, in some of these states, if you violated the Black Codes, you were a criminal. They could arrest you, and a punishment they could give you was to force you to go work on rich people's plantations. So they essentially turned prisoners into slaves again, right? And if you attempted to escape, they could extend your sentence. And if you didn't follow the rules, they could extend your sentence. And so they found ways in some of these states to basically continue slavery. And the Black Codes are an example of, legal ways around the slavery ban. It's still continued, right? Hugely sort of offensive thing. People in the North were shocked by this. You remember they fought the Civil War to sort of end this, and yet here it's still, persisting. So he comes into conflict with Congress, right? He even goes as far as to say Reconstruction's over. Johnson declares it a success. He says everything's good. The Congress at the time obviously disagrees. They say, look, this guy's pardoning these rebels. He's continuing slavery through these, legal, loopholes at the time. And they're going to begin to push through laws pushing for more civil rights, expanding the rights of slaves. And so you have things like the 14th Amendment, right? This idea that they want to grant citizenship to freedmen Johnson opposes this amendment. The Republicans in the time period during an election actually win control of both the House and the Senate and are able to begin to push laws through without him being able to stop them. Remember that if you have what's called a supermajority in Congress, that you can actually go around a president's veto. And so they can pass bills despite him trying to stop it. This is the time period known as Radical Reconstruction. I don't know why I have C handout from yesterday. There's no handout. Bummer. But they had talked about this time period. They're so powerful. Congress has so much authority that they're able to pass whatever laws they want. He's unable to stop them. Historians call this Radical Reconstruction as that third period of these Reconstruction plans. And some of them had some more wild ideas. Again, we see the idea of like dividing up plantation land come up again, but people sort of draw the line again at separating up that land. But the important thing, the takeaway here during Radical Reconstruction, the gist of it is it's very heavily punishing the South. It's banning Southern Confederate leaders from ever participating in government as long as this Congress is in control. Heavy taxes in the South, heavy economic punishment, stuff like that. They want them to pay, right? They also, though, begin to pass laws that purposefully limit Andrew Johnson's power. Okay, remember, they don't like the president. They're looking for a reason to come at him. And so the Republican government at this time period, the Republican Congress, passes one law in particular, which is called the Tenure of Office Act. And it's an interesting idea. So the law, basically, the gist of it is that you don't have the authority as president to remove anyone from any federal position without Congress's approval. That's the gist of the law. So if you don't like somebody, even though the president has the power to appoint and remove officials in the federal government, this law says he no longer has that power. Okay, that he has to ask Congress for approval to get rid of them. And remember, a lot of those people were appointed under Lincoln, who are probably Republicans, the opposite party of Johnson. So there's a lot of people he'd like to remove. He can no longer do it without breaking that law. Well, he does it anyway. It's in the Constitution that the president can do that. His argument was that law doesn't matter. The Constitution supersedes, comes before, right? Laws that are made now, so I should be able to do it. He removes a bunch of people. The Congress says, we have you, right? You broke the law. And they take it to court, the process of impeachment, the ability to remove a president from office if they're found guilty, right? He is the first president to face an impeachment trial. It goes public. It's a huge scandal, right? And he spins it to be not a law versus, did he break a law issue. He makes it's a Congress versus the president issue. And you need a 2/3 vote of the Senate to be impeached from office. Andrew Johnson comes within one vote of being the only president in history to be removed from office. Right? We have had presidents impeached before, but we have not had presidents found guilty and removed from office. We've had presidents who've been impeached and they've been acquitted, right? Which means that they were not found guilty. It's happened more frequently, right? We've had Bill Clinton and Donald Trump have been two presidents who have faced impeachment, right? So you also have the idea that Richard Nixon, if he didn't resign, might have been the first president to actually be impeached, is what historians argue. Again, we'll never know. But other than that, there's nobody else, right? Impeachment's a pretty rare thing through most of presidential history. The fact that he was one vote away was pretty scary for him. We will not really hear from Andrew Johnson for the rest of his time in office after this impeachment. There are rumors or theories that he struck a deal with senators and made an agreement that said, if you don't impeach me, I will stop vetoing laws and I'll let you pass your laws and I'll lay low, right? He didn't want to be the first guy to go in the history book, for being removed from the presidency. Either way, he struck some sort of deal there and got to stay president till the end of his term, but we don't hear him getting into fights with Congress or blocking them anymore. So clearly, some sort of lesson was learned or a deal was struck, right? From this point forward, it's going to kind of be that Congress running the show for a little while. Under this Congress, Reconstruction will be at the best that it's going to get. Things will work in the direction of progress. We'll talk next time about, some of the first black congressmen are going to be elected. Things start to make progress, and then it makes a turn for the worse and ends up, ending with sort of a whimper and not necessarily a boom, right? It falls apart. But that's a video for next week. We'll stop there at 20 minutes almost exactly. Keep up the good work. Goodbye.